The knock was a thief in the night, stealing the silence Eben had spent a decade cultivating. It wasn't the wind rattling the frame, nor the scuttling of some prairie varmint. It was the sound of a knuckle on wood, 3 deliberate raps that echoed the rhythm of a heart he hadn't heard in 10 years. He sat rigid in his chair by the cold hearth, the leather of his father's Bible cool beneath his palm, the wick of the lantern sputtering its last rites over a pool of kerosene. Outside, the wraith plains were drowned in a moon so stark and white it looked like a skull bleached in the sun. The mist was already rising from the hollows, a spectral tide that swallowed the fences and blurred the line between his land and the endless, whispering grass. He didn't move. Whoever it was would go away. They always did. The occasional lost traveler, the rare circuit preacher chasing souls as lost as himself. They would see the darkness of the cabin, feel the chill that clung to the cottonwood tree out by the rise, and they would move on. This place was a grave, and graves didn't get visitors. Another knock, harder this time, insistent. A shiver, cold and sharp as a needle, traced a line down his spine. It was the same cadence, the one Maylie used to use when she'd forgotten her key, a playful little triplet that used to make him smile. He squeezed his eyes shut, the memory a ghost against the back of his eyelids, her laugh, light as dandelion fluff, carried on the summer wind. "Let me in, you old bear," she'd say, her voice muffled by the thick oak door. "Your supper's getting cold." But supper had been cold for 10 years. The hearth was a tomb of ash. And Maylie was sleeping under the cottonwood. He'd put her there himself. He'd shoveled the dirt, piled the stones, and carved her name into the biggest one with the tip of his hunting knife. Maylie Thorne, beloved. The letters were shallow now, worn by a decade of wind and weeping rain. But they were there. He'd checked them just this morning, his fingers tracing the grooves as he did every dawn, a rosary for the faithless. A small sound, thin and reedy, pierced the night. It wasn't the knock this time. It was a cry, a baby's cry. A raw, desperate wail that clawed at the silence and tore it to shreds. Eben's breath hitched. His heart, a dormant, petrified thing, gave a painful lurch. He'd only heard a sound like that once before, in a drafty room in a town he never went back to, a sound that had been swallowed by a deeper, more terrible silence. He pushed himself up from the chair, his joints groaning in protest. The floorboards creaked under his weight, each sound an accusation. He moved toward the door, not with intention but as if pulled by an invisible string. His hand trembled as he reached for the iron latch. This was madness. A trick of the wind, a phantom of his own making, born of solitude and too much rot-gut whiskey, though he hadn't touched a drop in years. He was a man who buried things, his wife, his hopes, his past. He didn't open doors. He pulled the latch. The door swung inward on a complaint of rusted hinges, and the moonlight spilled onto the floor like a shroud. And there she was. Maylie. Not a memory, not a ghost. Flesh and blood and breathing. She wore the same dress she'd been buried in, a simple calico of pale blue, now faded and worn at the seams, but unmistakably the one he'd chosen. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was unbound, falling over her shoulders just as it had on their wedding day. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, held the same light, the same depth, the same unbearable recognition. They found his, and for a moment, the 10 years between them collapsed into a single silent heartbeat. He saw the confusion in them, the weariness, but also the same love that had been his anchor and his undoing. It was her. It was Maylie. His mind screamed denial, a frantic, cornered animal, but his heart. His heart knew the curve of her lips, the slight tilt of her head. Then his eyes fell to the bundle in her arms. A baby, swaddled in a tattered wool blanket, its face scrunched and red from crying. The cry had quieted to a soft whimper now, a fragile sound against the vast, empty plains. The child couldn't be more than a few months old. As he stared, its tiny eyes fluttered open. They were his eyes. the same dark, brooding brown that stared back at him from his shaving mirror every morning, the same eyes that had belonged to his father and his father's father. The baby shifted in her arms, a small fist waving in the air, and a word, soft as a sigh, slipped from its lips. Pa. The word was a hammer blow. It shattered the stillness, shattered the fragile shell of the world Eben had built around himself. Pa. It echoed in the hollow chambers of his chest, a sound he had longed for and dreaded in equal measure. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest as if to hold his splintering heart together. He looked from the child's familiar eyes to the impossible face of his wife. No, he whispered, the word a dry rasp in his throat. You're not, you can't be. Her expression didn't change. She just watched him, her gaze steady, a deep, fathomless sorrow pooling in their blue depths. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't seem to have one. She just stood there on his threshold, a specter in the moonlight, holding a child that wore his face and called him father. Eben, she said, and her voice was the final damning proof. It was the same voice that had whispered his name in the dark, that had sung lullabies to a child that never was, that had screamed his name in a room full of blood and failure. It was thinner now, frayed around the edges like old lace, but it was hers. Can we come in? The air is cold. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He could only stare, trapped in the cross currents of a nightmare and a miracle. Grief was a familiar companion, a shadow that walked beside him every day. But this was something else entirely. This was terror. This was a reckoning. He had buried her. He had shoveled the earth, felt the weight of it on his spade, heard the final hollow thud of dirt on the pine box. He had mourned her, grieved for her, built his life on the bedrock of her absence, and now she stood before him, the very picture of the woman he'd lost, with a child that should not exist. He looked past her, toward the rise where the cottonwood stood sentinel over its single sacred charge. The grave. The nameless stone was a dark shape against the moon-drenched grass. It was undisturbed. The earth was settled. There was no sign of desecration, no hint of an impossible resurrection. Please, Eben. Her voice was a plea, a gentle pull on the thread that still connected them, a thread he thought had been severed long ago. The baby whimpered again, a fretful sound, and snuggled closer into her shoulder. He saw it then, on the child's cheek, just below the eye, a small crescent-shaped birthmark, the color of a faint bruise, a tiny moon on a tiny face. He felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, as if he'd been punched. He had a mark just like it, a faint silver crescent on his own cheek, hidden by the rough stubble of his beard. A family mark, his mother had called it, the thorn moon. He stepped aside, a puppet whose strings had been cut. He held the door open, a gesture of surrender. She drifted past him, a wraith of calico and memory, and the scent of her filled the cabin. Not the cloying smell of the grave, of damp earth and decay, but the scent of lavender and rain, the scent of Maylie. She moved toward the hearth as if she'd only been gone an hour, her steps sure and familiar in the dim light. She knelt before the cold ashes, her movements graceful, practiced. She settled the baby on her lap, cooing softly, her fingers tracing the line of his tiny jaw. The child quieted, his dark eyes fixed on her face, a look of pure, trusting adoration in them. Eben shut the door, the sound a final, definitive click that sealed them inside this impossible reality. The world outside, the world of reason and logic, of life and death, ceased to exist. There was only this room, this woman, this child. He turned and watched her, his mind a maelstrom of questions he was too terrified to ask. Who was she? What was she? A demon wearing his wife's face, a fever dream from which he would soon wake sweating and alone. Or was she, by some impossible, cruel twist of fate, truly Maylie, returned from the silent earth? And the child, dear God, the child. His son. The word was a brand on his soul. He had a son, a living, breathing child with his eyes, his mark, who called another man's ghost Pa. He walked to the table, his legs unsteady. He lit another lantern, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. The flame caught, casting a warm golden glow over the room, chasing the spectral moonlight back into the corners. In the fuller light, she looked tired, so incredibly tired. There were new lines around her eyes, a fragile, translucent quality to her skin, as if she were made of spun glass. The 10 years he had lived were etched on his face in deep furrows and shades of gray. On her, they were an absence, a hollowing out, a stillness that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "He's beautiful," Eben heard himself say, the word strange and foreign on his tongue. She looked up, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "He has your eyes." "And my mark," he added, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the child's cheek. The thorn moon. She knew. Of course she knew. Maylie had been fascinated by the mark, had often traced it with her fingertip as they lay in the dark. She'd prayed their child would have it. Their child, the one they had lost, the one who had taken Maylie with him. The memory rose, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. The small, rented room in that dusty, forgotten town. The midwife with her cold hands and her empty promises. The hours of agony. The single, weak cry that had been both a greeting and a farewell. And then the silence. The terrible, final silence, broken only by his own ragged sobs. He had buried 2 that day, not 1. A son with no name and the woman who was his world. He'd brought her back here to the land she'd loved and laid her to rest under the cottonwood so she could watch the sun rise over the plains. "What is his name?" Eben asked, the question a stone in his throat. "We just call him Boy," she said softly, her eyes not quite meeting his. He hasn't needed a name until now." The answer made no sense. Nothing made sense. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, and he gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. He needed to be sane. He needed to hold on to the solid, tangible things of his world, the rough wood of the chair, the cool glass of the lantern, the weight of the Bible on the table. But the most tangible thing in the room was the woman by the fire, and she was impossible. He walked over to the hearth, his boots loud on the floorboards. He knelt, his knees cracking, so he was level with her. He reached out a hand, slow, hesitant, and touched the baby's cheek. The skin was warm, soft, real. The child didn't flinch. He just watched him with those solemn, knowing eyes. His eyes. A surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him, rose in his chest. Love. A fierce, protective, paternal love that he thought had been buried forever. It was a poison and a balm, a torment and a gift. "Can I?" he started, but couldn't finish the sentence. She understood. She shifted the baby in her arms, offering him. Eben took him, his hands clumsy, awkward. The child was heavier than he'd expected, a solid, warm weight against his chest. His son. He held his son. A tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He hadn't cried in a decade. He thought he'd forgotten how. The baby reached up a tiny hand and touched his rough, unshaven face, his fingers curling into his beard. He didn't recoil from the unfamiliar texture. He just stared, his expression one of simple, profound curiosity. "He knows you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't decipher. "How?" Eben asked, his voice breaking. "How can he know me? How are you here?" She looked away, her gaze fixed on the dead ashes in the hearth. Some things don't stay buried, Eben. Some grief is too strong. It makes a space, a door." Her words were riddles, whispers from a world he didn't understand. "A door to what?" "To now," she said simply. She rose to her feet, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the exhaustion in her face. She went to the window and looked out, her silhouette framed against the moonlit plains. "I've been walking a long time, so very long. I had to bring him home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, fraught with 1,000 unspoken memories. This cabin, which he had built with his own 2 hands for her, for them. The sturdy oak table he'd sanded until it was smooth as glass. The rocking chair by the window where she used to sit and knit. The late afternoon sun turning her hair to a fiery halo. He'd left it all as it was, a museum of his loss, each object a fresh wound. And now she was back, walking through the rooms of their life as if no time had passed at all, yet with the weight of an eternity in her eyes. He stood up, the baby cradled securely in his arms. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the eye of the hurricane. The shock was giving way to a bone-deep weariness and a terrifying fragile hope. Maybe he was mad. Maybe he had finally shattered under the weight of his loneliness. If so, it was a madness he found himself unwilling to fight. To hold this child, to see her face, even if it was just a hallucination, it was better than the empty silence. "You must be hungry," he said, his voice more steady now. It was a simple, domestic thing to say, a return to the old rhythms of their life together, and it felt more sane than any question he could ask. She turned from the window, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Yes, we are." He moved around the small cabin, the baby a warm, constant presence against his shoulder. He lit the stove, the scrape of the match loud in the quiet room. He found a tin of beans, some dried jerky, a heel of stale bread, a poor offering for a ghost, a feast for a man who usually ate standing up, if he ate at all. As he worked, he watched her. She had taken the rocking chair, her rocking chair, and was moving back and forth with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. She hadn't taken her eyes off him and the child, a look of profound, aching tenderness on her face. It was the look she used to give him when he'd come in from the fields, tired and covered in dust. It was a look that said, "You are home. You are safe. You are loved." How could a phantom, a demon, know that look? They ate in silence at the big oak table. He had put the baby on a pile of blankets in the open drawer of a dresser, an impromptu crib. The child had fallen asleep, his breathing soft and even. Eben watched the woman, Maylie, eat. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if she were learning how to do it all over again. He found himself noticing the small things, the details that had been blurred by memory. The way she held her fork, the way her brow furrowed slightly when she chewed, the tiny, almost invisible scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. It was all there. It was all her. "Where have you been?" he asked finally, the question gentle, not an accusation. She set her fork down. She looked at her hands, then at him. "I don't know," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It's not a place you can name. It's a road, a long road, and it was always leading here, to him." She glanced at the sleeping child. "Was he with you?" "Always," she breathed. "From the beginning. He was the reason for the road." Eben's mind reeled. He tried to piece it together, to find a shape in the shadows of her words, but there was nothing to hold on to. A road, a space made by grief. It was the language of dreams, of madness. But the sleeping child was real. The woman across from him was real. He had to choose what to believe. He could believe he was insane, or he could believe in the impossible. He looked at her, at the quiet dignity in her sorrow, at the unwavering love in her eyes, and he made his choice. For now. "You should rest," he said. "Both of you." She nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over her face, making her look even more fragile. He stood and led her to the bedroom, his bedroom, their bedroom. He hadn't slept in it for 10 years. He'd used the small cot in the main room, unable to face the emptiness of the bed they had shared. The room was just as she had left it. Her hairbrush was on the dresser, a few golden strands still caught in its bristles. Her favorite quilt, the one with the pattern of migrating geese, was folded at the foot of the bed. A pressed wildflower was tucked into the frame of the small mirror. It was a shrine, and he was bringing a goddess back to it. He fetched the baby, who stirred but didn't wake, and laid him gently in the center of the big bed. Maylie stood by the side, her hand resting on the carved headboard. She looked at the child, then at Eben. There were tears in her eyes now, shining in the lamplight. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He backed out of the room, pulling the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack. He returned to the main room and sank into the chair by the hearth. The fire in the stove had warmed the cabin, chasing away the bone-deep chill. He listened. He could hear the soft creak of the bed as she lay down, the whisper of fabric as she pulled the quilt over herself and the child. He heard her sigh, a sound of profound release, of a long journey ended. And then he heard her begin to sing. It was a lullaby. The lullaby. The one she'd been humming in the weeks before they'd lost the baby. A simple, sweet melody with no words, a tune she had made up herself. He'd only heard it a few times, but it was etched into his memory, a melody of hope and loss, an unfinished song. And now she was finishing it. Her voice, thin and ethereal, drifted through the crack in the door, weaving a spell of peace and sorrow through the quiet cabin. It was a song of homecoming, a song of a love that had refused to die. Eben Thorne, the man who dug graves, sat in the dark and listened to his dead wife sing their living son to sleep. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel alone. He felt terrified, unmoored, lost in a world that no longer obeyed the rules. But he was not alone. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray. Eben hadn't slept. He'd sat in his chair all night, a sentinel at the gates of an impossible dream, the lullaby echoing in his mind long after it had faded. He watched the light creep across the floorboards, a slow, inexorable tide. With the dawn came a fragile sense of normalcy, a feeling that was almost more frightening than the surrealism of the night. The smell of coffee, the clatter of a pot on the stove, the familiar weight of a new day. He moved with the quiet purpose of long habit, his body going through the motions while his mind wrestled with angels and demons. He made a fire in the hearth, the flames a welcome living thing in the gray morning light. He set a pot of coffee to boil and fried up some bacon, the smell filling the small cabin with a comforting, domestic aroma. He glanced at the bedroom door. It was still closed. He could hear no sound from within. A sudden cold fear gripped him. What if it had all been a dream? What if he opened the door to find the room empty, the bed cold, the only occupant the ghost of his own grief? He had to know. He wiped his greasy hands on his pants and walked to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pushed it open. The room was filled with the soft morning light filtering through the single window. And they were there. She was asleep, her face turned toward the door, her expression peaceful, younger than he remembered. The lines of exhaustion from the night before seemed to have smoothed away. The baby was nestled in the crook of her arm, his little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The sight was so painfully, beautifully normal that it brought tears to his eyes, a wife and child, asleep in the morning light, a picture of a life he had been denied. He backed away, closing the door softly. It was real. Whatever was happening, it was real. He went back to the stove, his hands shaking again, not with fear this time, but with a strange, burgeoning joy that was so foreign it felt like pain. He poured 2 cups of coffee, his hand hesitating for a moment before he added a spoonful of sugar to one of them, the way she liked it. He took the cups to the table and sat down, his own coffee untouched. He just sat and waited, listening to the silence, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of the promise of breathing. An hour later, the door creaked open. She stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, the baby still asleep in her arms. She looked at him, a shy, tentative smile on her face. "I smelled coffee," she said. "I made you a cup." he replied, his voice rough. The way you like it. Her smile widened, a genuine, radiant thing that lit up her whole face. It was the smile he remembered, the one that had made him feel like the king of the world. She came to the table and sat down, shifting the baby to her other shoulder. She took a sip of the coffee, her eyes closing in pleasure. It's perfect, she murmured. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft sucking noise the baby made in his sleep. It was a fragile piece, a bubble of domesticity floating in a sea of unanswered questions, but Eben clung to it with a desperate strength. I need to check the fences, he said finally, breaking the spell. It was a part of his daily routine, a ritual he hadn't missed in 10 years. And the graves. He had to say it. He had to see if the name on the stone had vanished, if the earth had sealed itself over, leaving no trace. She didn't flinch at the word. She just nodded. I'll be here, she said. It wasn't a question or a promise. It was a statement of fact. I'll be here. He went outside, the morning air crisp and cold. The world looked the same as it always did, the vast, empty plains stretching to the horizon, the sky a high, aching blue. He saddled his horse, his movements automatic, his mind 1,000 miles away. He rode out, his gaze fixed on the rise where the cottonwood tree stood. As he got closer, his heart began to pound. He was afraid of what he would find, and more afraid of what he wouldn't. He dismounted at the base of the rise and walked up the gentle slope, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The grave was there, unchanged. The pile of stones was undisturbed. The big, flat rock with her name carved into it was exactly as he had left it. He knelt, his fingers tracing the worn letters. Maylie Thorne, beloved. It was still there. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over him, extinguishing the fragile warmth that had taken root in his heart. If her grave was here, then who was the woman in his cabin? He looked back toward the small, lonely building, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney, a sign of life, of warmth, a sign of her. He was caught between two irreconcilable truths. His wife was in the ground. His wife was in his house. Both could not be true. And yet, they were. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the very ground beneath him was unstable. He looked at the grave again, at the patch of earth he had tended so carefully for a decade. It was different from the surrounding land. The grass was thin and sparse here, a pale, sickly green. He'd always assumed it was because of the shade from the cottonwood or something in the soil. But now, looking at it, he saw something else. It wasn't just that the grass wouldn't grow. It was as if the earth itself had refused to heal. It was a wound that would not close, a grave that had never truly accepted its occupant. He spent the rest of the morning in a daze, mending a section of fence that didn't need mending, his hands working while his mind churned. He was a practical man, a man of the earth. He believed in what he could see and touch. He believed in the finality of death. He had seen it in the glazed eyes of a cow with milk fever, in the still bodies of his parents, in the pale, cold face of his wife. Death was an ending. But what if it wasn't? What if grief, his grief, had been so powerful, so all-consuming, that it had, what? Punched a hole in the fabric of the world? Called her back from some silent, distant shore? It was the kind of thinking that got men locked away. When he returned to the cabin at midday, the scent of stew met him at the door. He stepped inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The room was transformed. It was clean. The dust of years had been wiped away. A jar of wildflowers sat on the table, their bright colors a stark contrast to the drab wood. The baby was awake, gurgling happily in his drawer crib, and Maylie was at the stove, humming that same unfinished lullaby, a clean apron tied around her waist. She turned when he entered, a smudge of flour on her cheek, and smiled that smile again. "You're just in time," she said. "I found some potatoes and carrots in the root cellar. I hope you don't mind." Mind? He felt like he was walking into a dream he'd had 1,000 times. a dream he always woke from with a hollow ache in his chest. But he didn't wake up. He just stood there, dumbstruck, the smell of home filling his senses, the sight of her chasing away the shadows in his soul. "It looks good," he managed to say. "He was a good boy while you were gone," she said, nodding toward the baby. "He watched me the whole time. Didn't cry once." Eben went over to the crib. The baby's dark eyes followed him. He reached a chubby hand toward him, his little fingers opening and closing. Eben offered his own finger, and the baby grabbed it with a surprising strength, his grip warm and firm, that solid, undeniable connection. He looked up at Maylee, a question in his eyes. 100 questions, but he couldn't bring himself to ask any of them. He didn't want to break the spell. He didn't want to risk shattering this fragile, impossible happiness. The days that followed fell into a strange, dreamlike rhythm. They lived as if she had never left. He would rise at dawn and do his chores, the knowledge that he was not coming back to an empty house, changing the very nature of the work. It was no longer a Sisyphean task to keep loneliness at bay, but a meaningful act of providing for his family. He would return to the cabin to find her there, a warm meal waiting, the baby cooing in his crib. They talked, but never about the past. They talked about the weather, the fences, the price of cattle in the nearest town. They talked about the baby. They talked about all the small, mundane things that make up a life. They were building a life on a foundation of unspoken questions, a house of cards in a hurricane. But for a while, it held. He learned the contours of this new Maylee. She was quieter than he remembered, more pensive. There was a distance in her eyes sometimes, a shadow that would fall over her face even when she was smiling. It was as if a part of her was still on that long, lonely road she had spoken of. And she was forgetful. Not about the important things, like how he took his coffee or the lullaby she sang every night. But small things. She couldn't remember where she'd put the salt, or the name of the neighbor who lived 10 miles down the creek. It was as if the decade she had missed was a blank space in her memory, a page torn from a book. The baby, whom they had started calling Little Eben, or just Ebby, was the anchor that held their strange new world together. He was a happy, healthy child, full of smiles and gurgles. He was growing fast, his little body filling out, his dark hair growing thick and curly. Eben found a love for him growing in his heart that was so fierce it was almost painful. He would spend hours just watching him, marveling at the perfection of his tiny hands, the depth of his solemn eyes. This child was his, a miracle, a gift from a God he'd long since cursed. He was the reason, she had said, the reason for the road. And as he held his son, Eben started to believe it. He started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had been given a second chance. But the grave was still there. Every morning, he would go to the rise and look at it, a grim reminder of the truth he was trying so desperately to ignore. The patch of barren earth, the name on the stone. It was a poison that seeped into the edges of his happiness, turning the sweet wine of his new life to vinegar. He started having nightmares. Not the old ones, of the blood and the screaming and the silence. New ones. He dreamt he was digging with his bare hands, the dirt cold and wet under his fingernails. He would dig for what felt like an eternity until he reached the pine box, and when he opened it, it would be empty. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the sound of his own ragged breathing loud in the silent cabin. One afternoon, a few weeks after she had arrived, he was in the barn, mending a harness. Maylee came out holding Ebby in her arms. The baby was fretful, crying a thin, weak cry. "He won't settle," she said, her brow furrowed with worry. "He feels warm." Eben put down the harness and took the child. He was warm, too warm. His skin was flushed, his breathing shallow. A familiar, cold fear clutched at Eben's heart. He'd seen this before. A fever that came on fast, that could steal a life in the space of a day. "We need to get his fever down," he said, his voice tight. "A cool bath." They worked together, a frantic, desperate team. They filled a basin with cool water from the well and gently lowered the baby into it. Ebby screamed, a raw, piercing sound that tore at their nerves. Maylie was crying, her tears splashing into the water. "Don't you leave me," she whispered to the child, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare leave me." Eben watched her, and a terrible thought, a sliver of ice in his gut, began to form. She wasn't just afraid of losing the child, she was afraid of losing him again. They stayed up all night with him, bathing him, whispering to him, praying to a God neither of them trusted. By dawn, the fever had broken. Ebby was asleep, his breathing deep and even, his skin cool to the touch. They had saved him. They collapsed in exhaustion and relief, clinging to each other, their tears mingling. In that moment of shared fear and triumph, the wall between them, the wall of unspoken questions, seemed to crumble. "I thought," she started, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I thought I was going to have to walk that road again." "What road, Maylie?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Tell me, please." She pulled back, her eyes wide and haunted. She looked at the sleeping child, then at him. "It's not a place," she whispered. "It's a memory, a choice. The grief was so strong, it left a door open. I just walked through. But the road back it's made of forgetting. To bring him here, I had to leave. So much behind. Bits and pieces of myself. That's why I can't remember things. Every step I took toward you, I had to leave a memory on the road behind me, like pebbles to find my way. But I can't go back. If we had lost him, the door would have closed, and I would have been lost, in the mist." Her words were a torrent, a confession, a plea for understanding. He didn't understand. Not really, but he understood the terror in her eyes. He understood the sacrifice. She had traded her memories, her past, for this present, for him, for their son. "You're here now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're both here. That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered. The grave was still there, a silent, damning testament to a different truth. And the question that had been festering in the back of his mind, the question from his nightmares, rose to the surface, demanding to be asked. If she had come back, if she had walked some spectral road from the land of the dead, then what was in the grave? What had he buried under the cottonwood tree? The thought became an obsession. It gnawed at him during the day, haunted his dreams at night. He would find himself staring at the rise, a shovel in his hands, the urge to dig almost overwhelming. But he was afraid. He was terrified of what he might find, and even more terrified of what he wouldn't. If the grave was empty, then his nightmare was real, and the woman in his house was… what? A ghost? A figment of his imagination? A demon wearing his wife's skin? But if it wasn't empty, if Maylie's body was still moldering in the cold earth, then the woman he loved, the woman who was the mother of his child, was an imposter. A stranger with his wife's face and his wife's memories. Or some of them, at least. He was caught in an impossible trap. To seek the truth was to risk destroying the fragile happiness he had found. To live the lie was to slowly go mad. He watched her, looking for clues, for some sign of falsehood, some crack in the facade. But there was nothing. She was Maylie. In every way that mattered, she was his wife. She knew the secret places in his heart, the fears he never spoke aloud. She knew how to soothe him when the darkness closed in, how to make him laugh when he thought he had forgotten how. She loved him, and he loved her. Whether she was a ghost or a woman, a memory or a miracle, he loved her with a desperate, all-consuming passion. One evening they were sitting by the fire. Ebby was asleep in his crib. Maylie was mending one of Eben's shirts, her fingers moving with a familiar, practiced skill. The silence was comfortable, easy, but for Eben, it was a screaming void. He couldn't bear it anymore. He had to know. Maylee, he said, his voice low. She looked up, a question in her eyes. That night, the night we lost the baby, he started, his voice trembling. What do you remember? The color drained from her face. The needle in her hand stilled. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. I don't, she stammered. It's one of the things I left on the road. It's too dark. I couldn't carry it. Try, he urged, his voice gentle but firm. Please, it's important. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. I remember. Pain, she whispered. So much pain. And I remember you holding my hand. You told me it would be all right. You promised. Her eyes flew open, and they were filled with tears. And then, just silence. A great, empty silence. And cold. So cold. The next thing I remember is walking. Just walking. With him in my arms. She looked at the crib, a look of fierce, protective love on her face. He was so small, so quiet. I knew I had to get him somewhere warm. I had to get him to you. Her words were a confirmation and a contradiction. She remembered the pain, the fear, his presence. But not the end, not the death, not the moment her heart had stopped beating next to his. It was a memory with a hole in it, a story with the last page torn out. And in that hole, that empty space, all his fears and doubts took root and grew. That night, he couldn't sleep. The nightmare came again, more vivid than ever. The digging, the dirt, the cold pine box. But this time, when he opened it, there was something inside. Not a body, just a single, pressed wildflower. The one from the mirror in their bedroom. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to face the truth, whatever it was. He rose from his cot, his movements slow and deliberate. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his boots, his coat. He took the lantern from the table and a shovel from by the door. He glanced at the bedroom. It was quiet. He could hear their soft, even breathing. His family. He was risking everything, but he had to know. He stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. He walked toward the rise, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He felt like a murderer, a grave robber, a desecrator of sacred ground. But he was also a man drowning, and the truth was the only shore in sight. He reached the grave. He set the lantern down, its golden light a small, defiant glow against the vast darkness. He looked at the name on the stone one last time. Maylee Thorne, beloved. Then he took his shovel and began to dig. The work was hard. The earth was cold and compacted, but he worked with a frantic, desperate energy, his muscles straining, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't think. He just dug. He dug through the layers of his grief, his memory, his love. He dug until the shovel struck wood with a hollow, sickening thud. He stopped, his body trembling, his lungs on fire. He fell to his knees, his hands raw, his mind empty. This was it, the moment of truth. He reached down and began to scrape away the remaining dirt with his bare hands, his fingers numb with cold. He found the edge of the pine box. He found the lid. He hesitated for a moment, a prayer on his lips, a prayer to a God he didn't believe in, a prayer for… what? What did he want to find? Emptiness? Or a body? He didn't know. He just knew he had to look. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he wedged his fingers under the lid and pulled. It came away with a groan of rotten wood and rusty nails. He held his breath. He lowered the lantern. He looked inside. It was empty. The pine box was completely, utterly empty. There was no body, no bones, no shred of a faded calico dress, nothing. Just the dark, damp smell of earth and decay. And in the center of the box, lying on the bare wood, was a single, pressed wildflower. Eben stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Empty. It had always been empty. For 10 years, he had been mourning at an empty grave. For 10 years, he had been tending a shrine to nothing. The world tilted on its axis. The ground fell away beneath him. He was adrift in a sea of madness. If she wasn't in the grave, then where had she been? And if he hadn't buried her, what had happened that night? A sound behind him made him jump. He scrambled to his feet, spinning around, his heart leaping into his throat. She was standing at the edge of the lantern light, her hair a wild halo around her face, her eyes wide and full of a terrible, profound sorrow. She was holding the baby, who was awake now, his dark eyes fixed on Eben's face. "I knew you were out here," she said, her voice a whisper in the wind. "I felt the cold." He just stared at her, the shovel hanging uselessly in his hand, the empty grave a gaping wound at his feet. He couldn't speak. He couldn't think. All the questions, all the fears, all the doubts coalesced into a single, overwhelming wave of confusion and despair. She walked toward him, her steps slow, hesitant. She didn't look at the grave. She just looked at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It wasn't your fault, Eben," she said softly. "You have to believe that." "What wasn't my fault?" he finally managed to croak, his voice a raw, broken thing. "What happened, Maylie? For God's sake, tell me what happened." She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze unwavering. "There was a choice," she said, her voice gaining a strange, new strength. "A door. The pain was too much. The loss, it was a chasm. I could have fallen. We both could have. But he—" She looked down at the child in her arms. "He was a light, a tiny, flickering light in the darkness. I could follow him, or I could let the silence take me. I chose to follow him. I walked the road away from that room, away from the ending. I didn't know it would take so long to get back. I didn't know I would have to leave so much of myself behind." He shook his head, trying to clear the fog. "But I buried you," he insisted, his voice cracking. "I saw you. You were gone." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "What you saw, what you buried, it was the part of me that couldn't make the journey. It was the grief, the despair, the silence. You buried the ending, Eben, so that I could find a new beginning." She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. "You buried my death so that I could live." He looked from her impossibly, beautifully alive face to the empty hole in the ground. He looked at the child in her arms, his son, with his own eyes, his own mark, the thorn moon, a sign of family, a sign of continuity. The lantern flickered, its light dancing on her face, on the tears that shone on her cheeks, the borrowed light, the baby's cry that had echoed twice, once in a room of death, once at a door of life. The stone with no name, because the person it was meant for was not there. It all clicked into place, not with the cold, hard logic of his world, but with the surreal, undeniable truth of hers. He dropped the shovel. It landed with a soft thud on the damp earth. He looked at her, at this woman who had crossed the landscape of death itself to bring him back his son, to bring him back his life. He saw the love in her eyes, a love so powerful it had defied the grave. He saw the sacrifice, the memories she had laid down like stones on a long, dark road so that they could be together. He saw the truth. Not a truth he could explain to any other living soul, but a truth his heart, his broken, battered heart, recognized. She was his Maylie. She had always been his Maylie. Grief had left a door open, and she had walked through it, not as a ghost of guilt, but as a testament to a love that would not be denied. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped in front of her, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath, of the child's body. He looked at the baby, at his son, this impossible, miraculous boy who had been his light in the darkness, even when he didn't know it. He reached out and touched the child's cheek, his finger tracing the crescent-shaped mark. The thorn moon, a new beginning. He looked back at her, at the woman who was his wife, his love, his miracle. The questions were still there, a faint humming in the back of his mind, but they no longer mattered. They were echoes from a world he no longer lived in. He didn't ask who she was, only what name the baby knew him by.